So I'm gonna go to bed.
Okay, recording. It looks like we're a go. All right, how you doing, Grandma?
Doing great. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited.
I really should have written all this down a long time ago. But
Yeah,
I
think we all
wanted to,
should.
yeah, I wanted to start with, we know the story of how Bridget and Gottlieb,
Yeah,
Bridget
yeah.
and her sister Marjorie, which if you think of saying Marge with an Irish accent came out Madge. So she was known as Madge all her life. Came from Ireland, and there's a little church at Battery Park, and the nuns there would find places for the Irish girls to work as domestics. Bridget got a job as a maid, and this was a man, very wealthy man, who owned steel mills. Gottlieb came, he was the second son, which means he wasn't going to inherit the embroidery mills. And he came to America, and when he landed, he was wearing the height of fashion, which was a green suit. And he says, now, then he knew why they called them greenhorns, and that's what he felt like, because there were so many, it was very peaceful, you know, up in northeastern Switzerland, even though it was a beautiful city. And there were people from all over, and they were all speaking different languages. And his main language was German, because that part of Switzerland was close to Germany. And he had friends in Fort Lee, which is just over the Hudson by the Palisades. And he got a job with this same oil millionaire as a chauffeur. He went to Cooper Union, which is, if you can Google it, it's a very famous school in Manhattan. I think it's kind of more downtown. And he learned auto mechanics, and he just was a natural. He picked it up very easily. And he got a job with the same person, and that's where he and Bridget met. Well, they weren't there too long. I don't know exactly how it was, and this man died. And he left all of his employees money in his will. So Bridget got money and Gottlieb got money. And they wanted to get, they fell in love, obviously, and they wanted to get married. Well, Gottlieb was Jewish and Bridget was Catholic. And they didn't want to let them get married. The family didn't want to let them get married, let her marry him. But they finally managed somehow. I guess one part of the family had some kind of influence. So they got married, and they bought the rectory of a church that wasn't being used, because she wanted a house. And my mother said they used to sit in where the priests ate, in the refectory, and they had this long, long table. It was just them. So they had 4 children. My mother, Julia, my uncle, Patrick, who got the name of Gottlieb. They didn't want to name him Gottlieb because they had a promise to raise their children Catholic. And then there was Dennis, who was Patrick's twin. And then there was Albert, who was always called the baby, and he died very, very young. They called it the summer sickness. I don't remember exactly, and I could look this up, but he might have only been like 6 months or something. And Julia, Patrick, Dennis died too, and I don't remember those facts right now. They then Bridget got sick. Gottlieb had always promised to take her back to Ireland to see the family and bring the children back so that her parents could see their grandchildren. But she died. And so Gottlieb hired a housekeeper, and he raised them. So when my mother went to school, they both went, Patrick and Julia both went to a Catholic school. And she took a course where she learned typing and steno. And it was like, I guess it was a high school, and she started work right away. Now, my other grandparents, Luigi and Rose, came from the Naples area of Italy, but they lived up towards the foothills, not all the way up in the mountain, but the foothills. And there were hot springs there. They had a farm. They worked very hard. My grandmother told me stories of how she would get up in the morning and they wouldn't have much of a breakfast, coffee and whatever was left over. So she would start cooking dinner. Their dinner was in the middle of the day. And I think she said she would start her bread the night before and leave it covered over and then put it into bake in the morning. So when it came time for lunch, she would pack up the lunch and she would take it out to the field where the men were working. And while they were eating, she would pick up the plow and plow the fields, or whatever season of the year it was. She would just continue working. She worked obviously very hard. And the story that I was told was that they raised flax and they made rope from hemp. And I guess it was my great grandfather was a traveling salesman. After they had that, he would drive around to different villages and sell the rope. So my favorite joke is my great grandfather was a traveling salesman. I'm probably related to a lot more people in Italy than I know. Okay. And I don't think she really wove all her linen together from the flax, but she did have good, they probably sent it out to the mill. The miller got, the weavers got a portion of it in return. Instead of them paying the weaver got part of the cloth. And she told me one time that she had all her children sitting in a chair, because when you work so hard growing the flax to make the linen, and then you had to cut it up and make the sheets and all, they didn't have their babies in bed and have that fine cloth stained. So they came to America naturally, like so many others. They wanted a better life and they wanted to bring up their children where they had more opportunity. Oh, a side note, there's a tradition that's still carried on today in the hills around Naples. And I might have told it this. The shepherds would play bagpipes. At Christmas time, they would come down into the city and they would play all the old carols and songs for the people in town. My grandpa, Luigi, played the bagpipes. And my Fontanini said, I have 3 people who play bagpipes. And there's 3 different bagpipes. I don't know which kind he wanted, which kind he had, but he brought it with him to America. And I don't know what happened to it when he died. But I just thought it was an interesting thing that, that tradition is still carried on today. So they decided to come to America. And my grandfather had a brother named one of the Ninja Turtles, Donatello. I think it was Donatello. And they came to America together, that's all of them. So they went to Ellis Island and they were going through, and the people, they were like side by side, but 2 different customs people or immigration people were there. So that we're trying to tell them what their name was. Del Bagno means of the bath. They might have gotten that name, we don't know for sure. They might have gotten that name because they came from the part of Naples where the springs, the hot springs were, the spa. So they were trying to spell it out. And my grandfather's name came out, capital D-E-L, capital B-A-G-N-O, but he says, you don't pronounce the G, it's Bagno, which is bath. His brother was trying to tell his person, and he says Del Bano. So the man wrote down Bano, and he says, no, there's a G in there, and it came out Bango. And the rest of their lives, one went Bagno, and the brother went at Bango. Okay,
Wow.
so they had relatives in Newark. And my father was born in Newark, New Jersey. As soon as they could save enough money, and I think my grandmother must have worked sometime too, they moved to Staten Island where it was cheaper, and they bought a house. And if you ever had a chance to go back there and ride the little old Staten Island Railroad, all the houses there, and I saw the same thing in Italy, and I said, oh, it's just like back home, had long, long backyards, and they planted extensive gardens. They grew enough tomatoes that my grandmother canned them, and they had used for a whole year until they grew again. My grandfather had, my mother said his tomatoes were absolutely amazing, like nothing you ever tasted. He had an old barrel, like a wine barrel, and he put it under the water spout coming, collected the rainwater, and he almost filled it all with manure. And he had a tap at the bottom, and he drew it off. This is called manure tea. And that's what he used to fertilize his garden. And he had his own homemade pesticide, and he would spray it at, and he was a wonderful, wonderful farmer. So one day I wasn't born yet, my mother took my two brothers down to see spend the afternoon there, and they said, don't eat any of the tomatoes. Well, they used to go there, and they ran out into the garden, they would pick a tomato, and they would just hold it in their hand and eat. It was so good. But he had just sprayed. And when they went out there and they saw them eating it, they were so worried. So they lived in a part of Staten Island called Rosebank, and the nearest place they went to was Stapleton, which was they had a big drugstore. And the druggist, and back then, everybody called the druggist Stuff, and he gave them something to keep them from being sick. So anyhow, prior to that, my mother was living in the Bronx. My father was living in Staten Island. Now, when my mother died, I went to her funeral. The day afterwards, I picked up my niece Geraldine and her daughter Julia. She's the fourth Julia. Is she the fourth? The third, whatever. And Joey and Anna's son had one of those really nice outfitted vans, and he took us for a ride so I could catch up on the changes to Staten Island. We went to lunch, then we went back to Aunt Anna's house. So the man next door came out, and he said, and Anna told him, that I was here for my mother's funeral. He came over to say he was sorry. He says, I knew your family. Well, Staten Island, the Italians are like a small town, even as big as Staten Island was. Everybody knew everybody. And he says, I remember your mother so well. One of my favorite stories. You used to see her walking along, pushing the baby carriage with a book in her other hand. She loved to read. My father loved to read too. Then he told me a story about my Uncle Jimmy. My Uncle Jimmy had died of testicular cancer before I was born, so I never knew him. And I think he was one of my brother's godfather. My Uncle Frank, my father's other brother, was my godfather. About the time when the Duke of Windsor, the one that married Wallis Simpson, had come to New York, and he was a favorite with everybody, and everybody was wearing Windsor ties and dressing like him. Well, my uncles and my father liked to dress nicely. They lived at home, they would work, they would come home, they would give my grandmother their pay packet, and she would give some of the money back to them to do whatever they want, go out and all. And I think she made them they lived there and she made them their lunch, whatever. Well, they all like to dress nicely. And they always did. My Uncle Frank, every time you saw him, he was really spiffed up, even if he was just going to the movie. So this friend of the neighbor of Aunt Anna said, "Did you know we used to call your uncle the Duke?" And I said, "No, I didn't. I don't know much about him at all." They were stevedore, longshoremen. People back in New York could say, "Oh, he works longshore," and you know what they meant. They said yes, because he spent most of his money on nice clothes so that they would go out on a Saturday night and he would be all dressed up. So here's my mother in the Bronx and my father on Staten Island. And how did they meet? They met in Roseland, and you can Google Roseland. It was a very famous dance place. And my mother went there with some friends, and my father, I don't know if he went with his brothers or some of his friends, but that's how they met. Well, my mother wasn't Italian, so there was that thing about, well, we wanted you to marry a nice Italian girl. And he said, "No, I love her. She loves me. We're going to get married." They got married, and they went to live with my grandparents. And my grandfather was very handy, and this is something he saw all the time. He would build benches and chairs and to sit outside. So my mother bought a primer, Italian American, and every night after dinner, because she was working, and she would help my grandmother, clean up and do dishes. And then she and my grandfather went outside and he taught her to speak Italian. Now, if you can imagine what it sounds like to have somebody with a Bronx accent speaking Italian American Italian, well, that's what my mother did, but people understood her. And she taught my great nephew, Andrew, Italian, because she used to take him to the Lighthouse for the Blind every day. Bus, ferry boat, subway, and they would spend the day or however many hours it was and back. So to keep him amused, she would sing him songs in Italian and tell him fairy tales and things like that. So 2 stories I want to tell you about my parents. When World War II came and my mother was working, I don't remember where she was working at the time, but she waited till I went to kindergarten before she went back to work. So she got a job with the Army. Now, I don't know if you know what's Staten Island, it's separated from New Jersey by the Kilvan Cove, which is a waterway. And at one point, there's on Staten Island side, it's called Port Richmond. And on the Jersey side, it's called Bayonne. At the time, we had a ferry going, it was a very short ride, plus the Bayonne Bridge. And the Army had a facility there called Port Johnson. And it's where they sent out, the boats would come and they would put on trucks and jeeps and whatever to send overseas. My mother got a job as a grease monkey. Not a lot of women drove at that time, but she did. And they had to get the jeeps and trucks ready, so they had to be greased and oiled and lubed. So one night before she was going home, and you had to police your own area, she spotted an oil drip under a truck, and she went underneath it to clean it up, and somebody, not knowing she was underneath, started up the truck and drove it over her ankle and fractured it.
Wow.
So she was wounded in World War II. And I remember sitting on the front steps, there were 5 steps, and waiting for her to come home. And they had to get, go through telephone calls. They took her to the right away to a hospital. And I guess the neighbors knew about it before I did, because I was still sitting out there, but they did take me to see her in the hospital. And that one ankle was always a little more swollen than the other. Well, it might have been the next Christmas after that. Someone had taken a store and stocked it with toys just for the Christmas season. And I used to walk by and there was this stall. And it was one of those, it was basically a stuffed rag doll. And it had loops underneath where you could slide your shoes into them and then dance with the doll, because this was a great big, for 6 or 7 year old, whatever it was a very tall doll. It was just your size. And I think somebody came out with one of those later on, just my size dolls. And I used to stop and look at it every day. And I, of course, when I was asked what I want for Christmas, I said, I want that doll. And I think I called her Rosie. And when they went to get it, there was only one left. And my mother says, well, she wants, we're going to take it. And it just happened that when they stuffed this doll, her ankle, the same as my mother's, was bigger than the other foot.
Oh, really?
Now, my father's story that I like a lot, and you can Google this because it's a long, long article.
Okay.
When we went to war, declared war on Germany, the start of World War II, the government decided to move the gold reserves from Wall Street down to Fort Knox. It was all very, very secret. Well, when the Freedom of Information Act came out, my father told my mother this story. He worked for the B&O Railroad. From when he got out of school, he never went on to higher education. They all had to go out and get a job. And they first started him out sweeping out railroad cars. And then he worked his way up until he was a conductor. And they came to him one time and they said, you've been chosen for this assignment. You're going to have to be away from home for a few nights. So he just told my mother that somebody bumped him. The bumping system was, if you had seniority and somebody retired, you could bid on his job and you beat out everybody who had less seniority. And he says, well, I got this chance for this, and he had to go. So when the Freedom of Information Act came out, he told my mother that he was one of the conductors on the train that moved the gold reserve from New York to Fort Knox. I don't know how many days, but it's a very, I Googled it. It's a very interesting thing. And I think it was on the History Channel one time. And I didn't know about it at the time.
Wow, that's amazing.
Well, maybe I didn't realize, because they had photographs and they were the conductors standing there, and one of them could have been my father. So he told my mother I was a millionaire for 2 nights or whatever
Right.
it took him to go there. So he was
Too bad he couldn't get a cut.
my father was very pro-America, very patriotic.
Mhm.
There's another funny story. My mother and my sister went shopping in Manhattan one time, and it was windy and it started raining. They bought scarves and they tied them over their head like kerchiefs. And they came home and my father was furious. He says, I kept telling my mother she was in America. She didn't have to wear the shawl on her head anymore. She had to wear hats, and here you come with that. But other things, I know you would ask me about Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941, and I was born February 16th, 1936, so I wasn't quite 6 years old. I remember them talking about it, but at the time, and I don't know what time it was in New York when it was early Sunday morning in Hawaii, but I have vague things which might have been brought out by people retelling the story of them, everybody being very concerned at the time. But I don't actually, like I said, I was not quite 6.
Right.
So I don't remember that. So, okay, so my mother and father met and they got married. My father was working for the B&O at the time. And you asked me about our house. It was a duplex. We lived in, there was 4 families, 2 down and 2 up. And the apartments were flipped. So ours was the same as my next door neighbor downstairs, but in reverse. And then the people upstairs had one there. Now, my sister, Lucille, was the oldest. My mother, when Lucille was born, was working for a theatrical agent. And his biggest star was a Broadway star whose name was Lucille. So my mother, instead of naming her for herself or anybody else, she says, well, Lucille is almost like Louis, which is Luigi. She got away and she named my sister Lucille. And I always meant to see, you know, the year she was born, if there was a Broadway actress named Lucille. Then there was my brother Jerry. He was next. And then my brother Louis. And then there was a gap of like 6 years before I was born. My mother used to tell me she would give me a bath in the kitchen sink, and she'd spread blankets on the kitchen table while she dressed me in my PJs. And my brothers and my sister would stand on the other sides of the table and call me to see which would get my attention. And I would, you know, like turn to them, or when I got big enough, crawl over to them. My sister liked having me. It's like JR and Bunny. It's like a living doll.
Yeah.
After a while, my brothers, when they got older, they didn't want to have anything to do with me. They weren't mean or anything. I mean, they just called me brat. Well, after 6 years, I was like almost an only child, you know, and they said I was spoiled. But my mother, I think, was trying to make up for the fact that she was working. She loved to work. She liked working better than staying home. And she was a fabulous cook because her housekeeper had been not professionally trained, classic trained. My mother was the kind of cook who would rice the potatoes before she mashed them. And anything she made, it was just wonderful. So anyhow, so my sister Lucille married Jim Carter, and they had Jim, Brenda, Denise, Bruce, and Lucy. Jerry had Geraldine and Jeffrey, who lives in Atlanta. And Louis had Jean Helen. Jean is my sister-in-law. Helen was her mother, so they named my cousin Jean Helen. And Louis. I think my brother's name was, I don't remember. One of them was named Louis and one is named Lews because somebody mixed up in the hospital, anything like that. And I can't tell you the kid's name off the top of my head right now. My grandmother Rose had Frank, Jimmy, my Aunt Angie, and my father. My father was the baby of the family. And my Uncle Frank was jealous of him because he was my mother's favorite. And Angie didn't marry an Italian either. She married a man who had been divorced. His name was Al White. And he came from a moneyed family. I think his father was a judge. But when my grandfather died, my grandmother went to live with her brother in Newark, was Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe was like the head of the Del Bagno family. But then when Angie got married and they could afford a nice big house, she had a couple of nice houses because they moved a couple of times. And then my grandmother went to her and lived with her for the rest of her life. She was the only girl. My mother was her maid of honor because she wasn't married in church and none of her cousins would be her bridesmaid. It was one of those things back then. Okay, so we lived in Staten Island and I went through the public school system. Public school 16 was my school, and then Curtis High School. I don't know how the trees have grown since then, but you used to be able to see Curtis High School alma mater said high on a hill, and it was, and you could see it was Gothic. I'll show you the picture of it in my yearbook sometime if we ever have time.
Mhm.
So growing up, I remember our Christmases. My father was one of the first. One year he put up the Christmas tree. We used to put it up a few days before Christmas. Most people back then put it up on Christmas Eve, but he liked to do it ahead of time. And he put it on there, and he went out and bought some more lights, and then it turned out that the lights they had were still good. So we had an extra set of lights, and he put them in the windows. It's like one of the first people I ever saw put it in there. My brothers had a set of Lionel trains that my Uncle Pat had given them, and they were a big, beautiful set of things, which would probably be worth a bundle today if they have them. But we didn't have much room where we lived. And after a while, when the boys got bigger, my mother passed them on to my sister for her kids to play with. We used to put angel hair on our Christmas trees, which was spun glass. And it was horrible because it was glass. It was shards of glass. And when you touched them,
Right.
it got in your fingers. But we used to do that and tinsel. And we would wrap the presents, put them under the tree. And on Christmas Eve, they would go to midnight mass. And I would stay home. And I think I don't remember. I remember Jerry was head altar boy, but I don't remember what Lewis was. So he might have been the one that had to stay home with me when I was little. When they came home from midnight mass, and they would have a glass of wine or something, and Christmas cookies or whatever. But they would wake me up, and I could get one present from under the tree and open it. And then I had to go back to bed and open it up the next morning. After Jerry and Lewis got married and left, we used to go to Lucille's house on Christmas morning and open gifts with her kids, and she would make Christmas dinner there. Okay, so I'm trying to cover as much things. So I remember a lot about World War II, even though I don't remember what the day of Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
When we were in school, and this was a big school, and we had air raid drills. Instead of getting under our desks, they would take us out into the corridors away from the doors and windows as much as we can. So like there was a set of classrooms on one side, a set of classrooms on the other, and we would go down the middle aisle, and the teachers would read stories to us. At home, we did things like, if you fried something, you would reuse the oil till you couldn't use it anymore. And then you would put it in a tin can, and bacon grease, the same thing. And you put it in a tin can. Then you took the tin cans to the butchers, and they would wait, and they would pay you so much a pound. I remember rationing, and the ration books were like gold. You had to keep them, be very careful with them. And it was so much small neighborhoods. We had a bread store, a baker we went to, a butcher we went to, a greengrocer we went to, and the candy store, soda fountain place that sold cigarettes. Everybody had a confectioners in their thing. So the butcher would sometimes put a little something extra. If you only had a meat, which were red coupon stamps, food stamps, but it wasn't food stamps, it was ration stamps. And if you only had enough for a pound of ground beef, he might put 1.5 pounds for you. It was that kind of thing. I would go in there and he would give me a slice of bologna while I was standing in line with my mother, or a hot dog. He gave me the hot dog the first time. My mother said, "It's only bologna. You could eat it. It doesn't have to be cooked." And they were all Italian. We went to, except the deli was Jewish. And my brother Jerry worked there after school, and that's where I learned to eat lox, which was different then because the lox was drier, and they would leave it. They would slice it to order wherever you went. I didn't have a job when I was young until my senior year of high school. I know I'm jumping back from the rationing and stuff, and how we waited in lines, and neighbor would call another neighbor, "The A&P has sugar." Everybody would rush down there and stand in line, hoping you're going to get 1 pound of sugar or flour or whatever it was. But the New York City public school system had what they called the co-op program in coordination with big businesses in Manhattan. And this is the way it worked. If by the time you got to your senior year and you had all your requirements done except economics, which they made you take when you were a senior, you could join this program. Co-op. 1 week you went to work, and the next week you went to school. And so instead of taking one class in economics, they doubled it over. All the co-ops had the same schedule and the same class. And you did 2 periods of that. And then if it was history or another elective or something, you did 2 periods of that. While you were at work, your counterpart was in school. And I remember this girl as well as I could see her, and her name's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think about it. So I worked, she was in school. She worked, I was in school. I worked for the home insurance company in their main office downtown Manhattan. And I made photostats. Half of the time you sat with your arm, they had a rubber sleeve, and you put your arm inside. First you went to the dark room and got a metal box of light sensitive paper. And then you sat there, put your arm, put the box inside the camera, closed the door, put your arm in, and it had elastic, it came up to your shoulder. You opened the door and you took out one piece of paper and held it up to this glass. The person you were working with took the insurance policy, the claim, whatever it was that they needed a photostat, laid it down, and then you clicked, you took a picture, you put that one down, you put the next one up. When you got all done, you put everything back in the middle. It was like an attaché case, and took it to the dark room. The dark room had 2 doors, a window, and you opened one window, put the box that they opened the window inside with the lights off, just the red light, and took it out and developed the pictures. So there were 4 steps. So first, sometimes you worked on the camera, sometimes you were a feeder putting the papers down. Sometimes you worked in the dark room developing the photostats, and sometimes you took the wet photostats out and you had to put them through a dryer, which was like a canvas belt and a big drum, and went around. And I did that for my last year of high school. And when I graduated, I knew I wasn't going to go to college because your grandfather had it all figured out by then. So they asked me if I wanted to stay on, and they hired me, and I worked full time. And I made $1 an hour for 35 hours a week.
Mm.
And uh, so he went to the home insurance company after he got out of, after we graduated, and they hired him right away. He worked in I think it was the Michigan office, but in the home office, but he handled those things there. But they started him off with like $1.35. And every time we got a raise, he always got more than I did, which is
Mm.
what they did back then.
Right.
There was this program then, the Korean War was like over, but the draft was still on. So they had this program that if you knew your time, you were going to be called for the draft, which is why we didn't go to college. If you got, 4 or 5 of your buddies from your neighborhood who they figured you would all be the same age, from school, and went together, you could go in ahead of time to get it over with, because it's supposed to be 2 years, and you would all stay together. So there was this one guy in the neighborhood that talked them all into going. Your father, one of his best buddies, Teddy, who is JR's godfather, and I don't remember who else went, but they went. And sure enough, the one person that failed the physical or whatever, or couldn't pass the test, was the one who got everybody to sign up.
Mhm.
So he went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, which is, I believe, is still in operation. And they really wanted him to go to officers candidate school because he just aced. He just flew through every test they gave him. And he says, no, he was just in there for his 2 years. So he was there for a while, and we came out of basic, and they didn't know what to do with him. So they left him there as cadre. So he was like assistant to the sergeant, with the new recruits coming in, and they put him in the supply room, which was just a really easy job. Then he was assigned to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And he says, we're going to Massachusetts, quit your job. Well, they didn't like that at the home insurance company. I didn't give him 2 weeks notice. We packed up the car with whatever we could fit of some pots and pans and dishes and blankets and clothes. And then we drove up there. We got there, and they gave him the day off so we could go find a place to live. And we did find a nice place. There was elderly couple called the Hams, who rented out different parts of that, made their house into like 3, 4 little apartments. So we had a kitchen to cook and eat in, and a living room with a pull-out sofa. That was ours. And the one upstairs, I think, had had a bedroom besides, and the other one had a bedroom aside there. So we stayed there, and they put him in supply again. And he had no ambition, so he didn't want to stay. He just wanted to get done. So the Korean War was winding down. He was attached to the 29th Evac Hospital, which had just been rotated back from Korea. And he never left the United States, even though he was a Korean War veteran. His friend Teddy got sent to Germany. I don't remember where any of the others went. Then, before his 2 years were up, he started sending in applications to colleges. And he was accepted at NYU, which got him out, I think it was 3 months early. And so he left, but he didn't go there. He went to, I can't think of the name of it. I think it's a university now, whatever college it was. And he took accounting. And from there, he took insurance. But he didn't like selling insurance. And in the meantime, he was doing Encyclopedia Britannica, which meant that he would go to like a mall and they would hand out pieces of a ticket and say, give us your name and address. We're going to give away this set of Encyclopedia Britannica. Then you would take these leads and call them up and try and make an appointment to sell them Britannica. So I got the job of taking these things, it's called cold calling these people and saying, hi, I'm Julia from Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm sorry to tell you, you did not win the set we're giving, but we have this special deal and we'd like to send somebody over and they can explain it to you. You get this at a fabulous, markdown and stuff like that. He sold 2 sets and quit. It was very hard. He said, the sales pitch, you had to recite it, just made people like feel guilty that they weren't buying it for their kids. So he didn't stay with them. And then the deli across the street, there were 2 it was a strip mall like, and the one directly across from my house, which was this beautiful old Victorian that had been made into a 2-family house, came up and he decided he wanted to buy it. So we made them an offer and they took it. The woman's husband who owned it, her husband had died and she didn't want to run the store anymore. Neither one of us had ever worked in, retail sales or food store, anything like that. So I started going over there and I was working for them. So they would teach me without any pay. And then the deal went through, we bought it and we opened it up and we were there, I know, like 3 years. So we had, JR was already born. And then we had Tony and Albert and then Glenn and Guy. And then we sold it after that in 1963 and we moved to California. Okay. So here's a story on one of them. We had 2 playpens in the back, and if I couldn't get grandma to watch the kids, I took them all to the store with me and put them in the back. I had to go in 7 days a week, even though I didn't work full time. I might work from 9 to 3 and half a day on Saturday until we had somebody come in the afternoon and Sunday morning for the rush. And so I was standing in the store and I was pregnant. All my kids came 2 weeks early. And we used to, after the morning rush and the commuters were all on their buses and gone to work, I would make a pot of coffee and we would have maybe a toasted bagel or a fresh roll with butter, something like that. So a customer came in and I called to the back, what do you want? And he says, Thomas English muffins. So there was 1 package left because it was the day that Thomas Mann was coming, who was going to bring more later. Somebody came in and we stopped and talked. All the customers liked to talk. They thought you had nothing else in the world to do but talk to them. And so I says, well, is there anything else? He says, I think I'm going to take this English muffin. And just that minute, my water broke. So we had a crew to somebody to come in. And this was Tony and Al. And watch the store. And it had snowed. And there were people that just hung out in the drugstore. The man that owned the drugstore owned our end of the strip mall. There was us in the liquor store and the drugstore. I don't remember what else was there. Oh, there was a little restaurant, a laundromat, and then another deli at the other end, the Irish deli. And so we went in there, but there was snow all over the place. So the guy from the liquor store went into the drugstore and got all the guys that hang out in there. They'd go in and they'd have coffee in the morning, and then they'd sit and then they'd have a Coke and they'd sit and all like that. And they had to push us back and forth to get us out of the snowdrift so we could go to the hospital.
Wow.
With Glenn and Guy, my birthday was on a Friday and we went for Chinese food. And this was like halfway down the island. And it is funny now, to us, it would be nothing, but then it was like far away. A new restaurant had opened. So that Saturday night came and the person came into that worked for us, came into take over, and we went home. And your grandfather said to me, "What do you want for dinner? I'll get us some." And I said, "Oh, I hate to ask you, but I really feel like Chinese food again." So it was only twice that I asked for anything when I was pregnant. And I never said, "Oh, I have a craving for this," or anything like that. So he went out and he got it back and brought it back. We were watching Bonanza, and Glenn and Guy decided to be born. There's probably a lot of other anecdotes that I'm thinking of, but if you want to go back on any of the things that I was talking about, we could do that. I remember World War II, paper drives. My father got the News in the Mirror every day. At that time, they were 2 cents. And we saved them and we bundled them up, we tied them and we put them out at the curb. There was metal drives and we had a lamp. It was a standing lamp and it was like wrought iron. It was very big and very heavy. And I saw one at a antique shop one day and they wanted a lot of money for it. But we put that out. We saved tin cans. We collected ragweed where they were trying to make artificial rubber. We'd go to the open fields and we'd cut it and put it in a pillowcase and turned it in someplace. They had a contest, whoever collected the most got something. I don't know what it was. I know now that my father followed everything in the newspapers, every battle, everything that was going on. He read them every day. Year before last, in commemoration of the anniversary of D-Day, I decided, and I still did this from when your aunts and uncle, when I took your aunts and uncle, and then you went to the library during the summer for the summer reading program. I always picked out a topic, and that was my summer reading project. And I would read that. So I decided in honor of D-Day that I was going to read up on World War II. And I did some serious reading, but a lot of novels, because the good novelists do a lot of research, so you get a lot. And I learned a lot about that. I knew things we read. The Germans were masters at propaganda, but we did pretty good at propaganda ourselves too.
Sure.
And yeah. And I admired Churchill. We were supposed to. He was friends with Roosevelt. They came over and, to Washington, stayed at the White House and all. But he was really not that great.
He was ruthless. Yeah.
He was very stubborn. He had his own idea. If they had let us have our own way more, I think it would have been over a lot sooner. And the amount of lives lost was just tremendous. And I learned things like Rommel, when he came from Africa back to Europe, he wasn't well liked at all, but he was smart. And when he heard, and this went back and forth, they knew they were going to land, they didn't know where and all. What he did was um, the- it- Berlin would not give him the things he asked for, like men, tanks, gasoline, arms, cannons, whatever. He had his tanks, which he was noted for. What he did was he had his men go out, chop limbs off trees, shape them into points at both ends, stick them in wherever there was a field that a plane might land in. He put them there to save gasoline, etc. We sent a lot of gliders over. So the tow plane would release the cable and then they would glide, but they had to have a place to land. But we lost so many men because the planes went down in this field that had the spikes sticking up, and it just ruined them.
Hmm.
So anyhow, the neighborhood I grew up, we had a lot of kids, and we played outside till the lights went on. We were outside more than we were inside. Even in the summertime when it was hot, we had back porch, and underneath the back porch was shady, it was cooler, and we would play there. We would play board games like Monopoly. We played Monopoly all the time. We would go to the greengrocer and he would give us those wooden crates. We each had our own spot, and that was our house. We made tables and chairs and beds for our dolls. Or we played store, and those were the shelves for the whatever was sold. Or we played school. It was summertime, but we still played school, and those were our seats and our desks. There was a municipal pool. All right, it might still be there. And we walked down. We lived at the top of a hill, and so we walked all the way down to to this pool. And I think in the morning it was free, but then you had to get out and you could go back in again. But it wasn't very expensive. I think it was 10 cents. They went in and they gave you a wire basket, and there were changing rooms. We usually put our bathing suit on at home, but you put your street clothes in that, and it had a number on it, and then it had a little elastic band with the same number, and you put that around your ankle or your wrist to claim your clothes when you came out. There was a diving pool with several heights of diving boards. There was a shallow pool we called the baby pool. You could sit and splash in. It was very big, and the moms would sit in there with their kids and play. And then we had the one that was the 3-foot pool, which I actually think was bigger at other end. And we would spend hours there in the afternoon to stay cool in the summertime. And then we would just go dry off, put our clothes on, and walk back home. When I got older, when I was a teenager, the Parks Department used to put on dances with real orchestras. And they were held in the playgrounds, but most playgrounds had one area that had swing slides, monkey bars, and seesaws, and then another one with basketball courts. And they were held on the bigger playgrounds. They were held on the basketball courts, and we would just go there, and the orchestra played. Well, the funny thing was, I told you, Staten Island was a small town. My godmother's brother-in-law was a musician. I don't know what his daytime job was. And 9 times out of 10, I'd go there and he'd be there. And no matter where you went, you knew somebody. And that somebody would keep an eye on you. Okay, so I should have put the air conditioning on today.
Oh, you're doing all right.
What else? We had the rationing during World War II. Everybody was very good at saving things. You saved leftovers and you made your own soups and stews. And if it was somebody's birthday, and they asked you for an egg, you would give them that egg. or a half a cup of sugar or a quarter, so they could make a birthday cake or icing or something like that. Everybody took care of everybody else. I said we played outside. There was always somebody sitting by a window doing knitting or crocheting or reading or something, keeping an eye on the kids in the neighborhood. If anybody came into the neighborhood that didn't belong there, they would come out on the porch and stand there with their hands on their hips or whatever. So it was safe. And I know we had clothing rationing. So a lot of people made their own clothes. And we shared things too, like that. You made a dress, you would pass the pattern on to somebody else so they could use it and make a dress too. And in school, we still had home economics. We had sewing. And when you were in 6th grade, the girls had to make an apron and a little triangular thing to cover your hair, because in 7th and 8th grade you had cooking, so you had to have your apron and you had to make the apron to take the cooking class. But they did more than that. They did things like our textbook was from Cornell, and we followed the Cornell thing, way of washing. You wash your glassware first, and then your silverware, and then your dishes, and then your pots. And they rinsed them off. And if you rinsed them and with very, very hot water, it was okay to let them dry in the dish drain. Cornell said so. And
Okay.
you had a certain way you had to iron clothes and wash things and stuff like that. I think they would be good to have some of the classes we had then. The boys had woodworking and, they had shop. Well, even your uncles have shop. I remember they had to make a box. And I have a few things outside that they made. When up to the 6th grade, we had one teacher, and you went in one classroom and you spent the whole day there, and then you just went from subject to subject. When you went to the 7th grade, you get ready for high school, you changed and you went to Mr. Schwartz for science, somebody else for English, somebody else for math. Mr. O'Connell taught math, and he did math and art. So we changed, the bells would ring, you put your books away, and that bell would ring, and then you went to next course. So it got you ready for high school. We had mixed, we had, and I don't know how they did this. With the war on, we had one Japanese boy, and they didn't have to go to a camp or anything. David Ikufuji. And he stayed in our class the whole time and was mostly Italian, Irish, German, Greek. Then there were the Jewish kids, Black, and David. So we had mixed, and we didn't think anything of it. This is the neighborhood we lived in. And our Jewish people would meet you on the street and they'd say Merry Christmas, and you didn't think anything of it. And if I went to one of their houses, I knew that if they offered me milk, there would be in a glass that was only meant for milk, because they had 2 refrigerators to keep the stuff. But everybody got along. It was just, I don't know, it was different then.
Yeah.
We played outside a lot, and we played tag, we played jump rope, we played stickball, we played Red Rover, we played Mother May I, we played stoop ball. We bought those pink high bouncer balls, And we had different times there during kite time. Everybody got a kite. We'd run up and down the street and just get out of the way when the cars came. And there were empty lots between houses. So when we was real small, we would go sleigh riding just on those empty lots that had a hill. If you wanted to go really, you went up to Silver Lakes, which is a reservoir and a beautiful park, and you could go sleigh riding up there. But unless you had a car, you had to lug. It was quite a walk, but you could have pulled your sleigh. And they didn't like, the bus drivers didn't like you to bring your sleigh on the bus.
Mhm.
There were a lot
Wow.
of places. There were a lot of little ponds on Staten Island, and they would freeze over and you could go ice skating there. We had great beaches too. We had South Beach, which had a long boardwalk and rides from the Whip and the carousel to, I can't think of all the rides they had. Then they filled in some land down at Great Hills and made a beautiful beach there. And we used to go there. It took 3 buses to get to that beach. It had no rides or anything. And at low tide, you could walk a long, long way, but then it fell off into the channel, the Narrows. This was down past where the Verrazano Bridge is now. And spent a lot of time there when I was, we would go maybe 5 days a week to the beach when I was in high school. And we always would be near the lifeguard stand. So when we talked to them, and one day the lifeguard brought a guy over, was his cousin, and he sat down, we talked to them, and then they said, I have a boat, you want to go out for a ride? So we made a date, and we made lunch. My girlfriend, Claire, I think it was Claire, not her sister Laura, Claire and I, maybe lunch, went down beach, and the guy had a motorboat, he didn't let us do it. It had, the motor at the back of it. And we went out riding, but we stayed within sight of the shore, but we got to just spend the day, just going back and forth in the motorboat, and then we had lunch.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it all sounds great. Like, what was it like meeting Grandpa? What was that courtship like?
Okay. We went to the same church. My mother knew Aunt Josephine, but I didn't know him because I went to 16, which was down towards the water. He went to 17, was up on the hill. We didn't meet till we, like I said, we went to the same church. I never noticed him till we got into high school. And I wasn't even thinking about him. When I first met him in our high school, the juniors gave the prom for the seniors. So when you got to junior year, I was on committees, and I was in Horizon Club, and I was in the orchestra, and I was in the honors English. We all hung out together. And he wasn't in those classes, so we didn't have classes together even. I think it wasn't until we got to a science, one of the science classes, that we had a thing together. Anyhow, so I was on the prom committee, and they had to have some of the guys to do the heavy work of decorating the gym and stuff like that. So when the teachers gave me her keys, and she says, go and get a table from this room and get a couple of guys to go with you. And he said, I'll go, and took one of his buddies. And we went there and I unlocked it, and they got the table through the door. I don't think the tables had legs that bent. So, you had to angle it and get it out the other way and up. So we're going down there and he says, you want to hop on it? We'll carry. I said, yeah, right. Something like that. He said, no, go ahead. And so I did. And I hopped on the table and they carried me halfway down the hall on the table, but we couldn't do it and let them stay. But I was going out with somebody else at the time, and he was going out with somebody else at the time. So we never either saw each other until it was Christmas, because the prom was in December. Then I turned around at Mass, and there he was standing at the other side looking at me. So it wasn't until after the prom that he even asked me out. And but that's how we met. And in school, even though we were close to, we lived not that far apart.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, we were in high school. And then he was a hall monitor on his free period. And he got maneuvered his way into getting the post, which was outside the girls' lunchroom. You see, the girls had their own lunchroom. The boys' lunchroom was on the other side. It was a door, and then there was a staircase going up and a door going out. And the boys' lunchroom was on the other side. So the girls' lunchroom, the girls' bathrooms were down the hall. And he got the job hall monitor outside there, so he could see me every day. So I had to make sure I had to go to the bathroom every day after lunch just to walk by.
All right. Well, my day starts at 5:30 in the morning, so I better cut this short, but I would love to pick up again, maybe same time next week.
Maybe we could do that. Yeah. In the meantime, I'll see if I can find things. I don't know, going back to Gottlieb and Bridget, he died a year after she did. And everybody said, well, what did he die of? He died of a broken heart. Well, just recently, within the last year or two, I read an article that says there is such a thing where you mourn somebody so much, you don't, no matter what, even though he had children that he was leaving behind, he didn't want to live without her.
Absolutely.
And they had to get permission. Again, there's the wealthy side of the family, from the archdiocese to be buried with her. And this wasn't a common practice back then, but he had to have a concrete vault to put his casket in, because his casket could not, or coffin, there's a difference between the two, could not touch holy ground. But I'll tell you some more about what happened to my mother after her parents died. But it was some great talking.
Please do. This is great.
If you ever notice when we're in the around the family, I put my hand up when I want to talk, because everybody talks so much. This is great, being allowed to talk.
I love it.
I want.
No, absolutely. I'm just absorbed in it.
And
all right, well,
in the
thank you so
meantime,
much.
I'll try and find, I know I really should recopy the family tree. I guess I wanted to do it on one sheet of paper, and I did it on the brown craft paper instead of doing it on white paper, which didn't copy well. But we'll see what we'll go on from here.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it.
And I love seeing the baby. Oh, baby, I could eat her up. She's just so sweet.
Yeah, she's growing like crazy.
Yes. Cute and smart. Give my love and a hug and a kiss to Megan.
I will. All right. You have a great weekend.
Okay, Dawn. I love you, honey.
Love you. Good night.
Good night.